Amy parents handed me a notice raising my rent to $1,900 a month, insisting I start paying market value for the tiny guest house behind their property. They smiled as though they were doing me a kindness, saying it was finally time for me to contribute my fair share. But when I glanced at the financial ledger resting on their kitchen counter, the reality slammed into me like freezing water. Every additional dollar they expected from me was being funneled directly into my brother's struggling upscale coffee shop business. They believed they could drain me to keep their golden child's sinking dream alive. So, I didn't argue, I didn't shout. I simply signed the paperwork, packed my belongings, and let them carry out their plan. But before you hear how the bank delivered the ultimate wake-up call, comment below with the city or state you're watching from. I love seeing just how far these stories reach. My name is Suzanne. I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I believed I had a strong, supportive relationship with my parents. For the last 2 years, I've been living in the renovated guest cottage behind their primary home. It seemed like the perfect arrangement for everyone. I paid them $900 each month, a fair amount we had both agreed upon, helping them cover property taxes while allowing me to steadily save for the down payment on a home of my own. I worked hard, kept to myself, and never missed a single payment. Then came a Tuesday evening that changed everything. My parents invited me into the main house under the excuse of sharing dinner, but the moment I stepped into the kitchen, there wasn't a meal waiting on the table, only a single sheet of paper placed in front of my chair. It was an official, typed 30-day notice. My father cleared his throat while my mother offered me a stiff, rehearsed smile. Beginning the following month, my rent would increase from $900 to $1,900, a sudden $1,000 jump overnight. I sat there in disbelief, asking how they could possibly justify doubling my rent without any warning. My father leaned back, crossed his arms, and calmly explained that $1,900 was simply the current market rate for the neighborhood. He insisted it was long overdue for me to contribute fairly to the household, presenting it as a lesson in real-world responsibility. Their attitude was so smug, so carefully planned that I knew immediately this had nothing to do with market rates. The very next afternoon, I returned to the main house to drop off a spare set of kitchen keys. My parents were out, but as I placed the keys on the dining table, I noticed an open leather ledger beside a pile of bank statements. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer. What I discovered made my blood turn to ice. Page after page showed frantic, massive transfers sent to one particular account, my 31-year-old brother, Julian. Julian had always been the unquestioned golden child in our family. 6 months earlier, he had walked away from his corporate job to launch an artisanal luxury cafe downtown. He had absolutely no experience, an oversized ego, and a long history of expecting everyone else to rescue him whenever things fell apart. According to the statements, his cafe was bleeding money. He was already behind on his commercial lease, struggling to make payroll, and buried under vendor debt. My parents had already emptied a substantial portion of their savings, trying to keep his vanity project alive. That was when every piece of the puzzle fell into place. My unexpected $1,000 rent increase had nothing to do with market value or teaching me adult responsibility. They were squeezing me dry to guarantee themselves an extra $1,900 every month to bankroll Julian's collapsing dream. Growing up, it had always been this way. When Julian totaled his first car, they bought him another one, while I drove a rusty old sedan I paid for myself. When he dropped out of college, they erased his debts, but when I worked 2 jobs to earn my degree, I barely received a congratulations. They were treating my hard-earned savings like a personal piggy bank for their favorite son. Most people would have completely lost it, marched into the living room and confronted their parents for taking advantage of them. But I understood exactly how my family worked. If I pushed back, they'd twist the story, paint me as selfish, and accuse me of resenting my brother. So, I chose to play an entirely different game. When my parents called me later that evening expecting a fight, I looked them directly in the eye and said, "Okay, I'll sign the new lease terms, starting next month." The expression of complete relief on their faces was almost heartbreaking. They truly believed they had manipulated me into financing Julian's failure. My mother even wrapped me in a patronizing hug, praising me for finally stepping up for the family. What they had no idea about was that the moment I returned to my cottage, I called a property manager downtown. Using the savings I had carefully protected for years, I immediately signed a lease for a bright, beautiful one-bedroom apartment that would be ready in 3 weeks. While arranging my new place, I also completed a quick public records search on my parents' property. That was when I uncovered something enormous. The guest cottage where I had been living had never been legally approved as a separate rental unit by the city. Not only had my parents been collecting illegal rent from me, but they were also quietly trying to obtain a second home equity loan, using my market rate lease as proof of income to strengthen Julian's loan applications. They were digging their own grave, and I was simply going to let them climb into it. For the next 3 weeks, I played the role of the devoted daughter. I smiled through Sunday dinners, listened as my parents boasted about Julian's brilliant expansion plans, and nodded while they talked about how much my new $1,900 rent payment would help steady everything. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, I was quietly packing my life into boxes and moving everything into a secure storage unit, one load at a time. The day my new lease officially started happened to be a Saturday. It was also the exact day my parents and Julian were out celebrating at an expensive steakhouse, a dinner charged to a credit card, to celebrate the signing of my new lease. While they were out toasting my forced sacrifice, a moving truck pulled up to the guest cottage. Within 3 hours, every piece of furniture, every item of clothing, and every personal possession I owned had been loaded inside and driven away. I scrubbed the cottage until it was spotless, placed the keys on the kitchen counter, and locked the door behind me for the very last time. Around 9 p.m., my phone erupted. It began with 5 missed calls from my mother, followed by a flood of furious text messages from my father. They had returned home expecting to collect my first $1,900 rent payment, only to discover an empty, dark cottage. When I finally answered, my father was practically shouting into the phone. He demanded to know where I was, calling me an ungrateful, selfish traitor. "You ruined everything," he yelled. "Julian's bank approval depends on the rental income from that unit. How could you do this to your own family?" I listened quietly until he finally ran out of steam. Then, in a calm, even voice, I replied, "I told you I signed a lease for $1,900 a month, Dad. I just never said it was for your cottage." The moment I ended that call, the dominoes started falling, even faster than I had expected. My parents had been relying on my $1,900 monthly payment as documented income. They needed that guaranteed cash flow to qualify for a second home equity line of credit, which they had promised to provide to Julian's commercial lenders as collateral. Without my signature on their lease, and without that monthly deposit appearing in their bank account, their entire loan application collapsed overnight. 3 days later, the real nightmare began for them. The bank's underwriting department contacted my parents to carry out a mandatory audit of the income claims listed in their application. When the loan officer requested verified tax records and proof that the rental unit was occupied, my parents panicked. They attempted to claim that their tenant had unexpectedly broken the lease, but the bank decided to examine the property records for itself. That was when everything exploded. The bank's underwriters discovered that the guest cottage had never been legally approved by the city as a residential rental unit. Not only had my parents submitted false documents claiming legal rental income, but they had also committed loan fraud by exaggerating the property's borrowing capacity to support Julian's business venture. The bank immediately froze their credit lines and flagged their existing accounts for suspicious activity. But the consequences didn't stop with the bank because the audit exposed the illegal structure. The bank's compliance department was legally required to report the issue to the City Housing Board. Within a week, an official municipal inspector arrived at my parents' front door, issuing a substantial fine for zoning violations and serving them with a mandatory cease and desist order. My parents had tried to corner me to rescue their golden child. Instead, their own greed and dishonesty unleashed an unstoppable legal and financial disaster that exposed every lie their entire plan had been built on. With their credit lines frozen and the bank backing away, the illusion of Julian's successful business fell apart almost overnight. Without the cash my parents had promised him, Julian couldn't pay the rent on his commercial space, meet payroll for his employees, or pay the outstanding invoices owed to his coffee bean suppliers. Within 2 weeks, his suppliers stopped delivering shipments, his employees walked out after receiving bounced paychecks, and his landlord served him with an eviction notice. The artisanal luxury cafe shut its doors completely, leaving Julian with more than $150,000 in personal debt and no source of income. Back at my parents' house, the destruction was just as complete. The city fined them thousands of dollars for the illegal guest house and ordered them to remove the kitchen appliances immediately. Even worse, the bank demanded repayment of the initial funds it had already advanced during the loan application process. Between the municipal penalties, the bank's demands, and Julian's defaulted debts that they had co-signed, my parents found themselves staring at total financial collapse. To cover the growing debts, they were forced to list their beloved main house for sale at a steep discount just to avoid complete bankruptcy. That was when the desperate phone calls began flooding my phone again. This time, the anger had disappeared, replaced with pathetic, tearful pleas. My mother called me sobbing about how depressed Julian had become and how they were about to lose their home. My father, who had called me an ungrateful traitor only weeks before, sent me a lengthy email asking whether I would co-sign another loan for them. They even offered to let me move back into the main house completely rent-free if I would simply use my savings to pay off Julian's immediate debts. They weren't apologizing because they regretted the way they had treated me. They were apologizing because the consequences of their own choices had finally caught up with them, and they desperately needed someone else to rescue them. I sat in my new downtown apartment, looking out across the city skyline, and made my decision. I didn't yell, and I didn't try to get revenge. I simply sent one short, final message to our family group chat. I love you, but I will no longer set myself on fire to keep Julian warm. I wish you all the best. Then, I blocked every one of their numbers. It's been 6 months since that day. My parents eventually downsized into a small 2-bedroom condo, and Julian is now working a retail job